The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional shuffle of papers. Sarah Miller stood before Judge Eleanor Winters, her shoulders hunched and her eyes fixed on the floor. At 32 years old, Sarah looked much older, her face lined with worry and exhaustion from years of struggling as a single mother. The court calls case number 47,293, State versus Sarah Miller, on charges of check fraud, announced the court clerk. Sarah wore clothes borrowed from a church donation bin, a navy blue blazer too large for her thin frame, and a skirt that had seen better days. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood beside her public defender, a young attorney with too many cases and too little time. 20 feet away, at the back of the courtroom, sat 10-year-old Jake Miller. His small legs dangled from the wooden bench, not quite reaching the floor. He clutched his inhaler tightly, a habit he had developed over years of asthma attacks. The social worker beside him placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but his eyes never left his mother. "Miss Miller, you are charged with altering a paycheck in the amount of $600. Judge Winters said, her voice carrying throughout the small courtroom. "How you plead?" "Guilty, Your Honor," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The prosecutor, a man in a crisp suit, stood to present the case. "Your Honor, the facts are straightforward. The defendant altered her paycheck, adding $600 to the original amount. When she cashed it at Linden's Market, the owner noticed the discrepancy when reconciling his accounts. The evidence is clear, and the defendant has admitted guilt." Sarah's attorney rose next. "Your Honor, while my client acknowledges her wrongdoing, I ask the court to consider the circumstances. Ms. Miller has no prior criminal record. She's a single mother whose son suffers from severe asthma. The medical bills have been overwhelming, with insurance covering only a portion of his treatments." Judge Winters glanced at her files, her expression revealing nothing. She had been on the bench for 15 years and had heard many sad stories. A reputation for being fair but strict was well known in the county courthouse. "Miss Miller, would you like to address the court before I deliver my sentence?" Judge Winters asked. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I know what I did was wrong," she began, her voice slightly stronger now. "I've always taught Jake to be honest, to do the right thing. But when his inhaler ran out and I couldn't afford a new one," her voice caught. "I was scared. I thought I could pay it back on my next paycheck. I never meant to." She stopped, unable to continue. Judge Winters nodded, making a note on her pad. The courtroom remained silent as she considered her decision. Jake watched intently, his small hand squeezing the inhaler tighter. "The court understands your difficult situation, Ms. Miller," Judge Winters finally said. "However, the law is clear on this matter. Fraud is a serious offense, regardless of the motivation behind it." Sarah's shoulders slumped further as she realized what was coming. Judge Winters adjusted her glasses and continued, her tone firm and unwavering. "Taking into account your guilty plea and lack of prior offenses, I hereby sentence you to 18 months in state prison." A small gasp came from the back of the room. Jake's eyes filled with tears as the social worker leaned down to whisper something to him. Sarah turned slightly, trying to smile at her son, trying to be brave for him even as her world collapsed around her. The courtroom fell silent after Judge Winters announced the sentence. Sarah's public defender whispered something to her. She barely heard him. All she could think about was Jake. 18 months away from her son felt like a lifetime. The social worker, Ms. Thompson, gently placed her hand on Jake's shoulder. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered. "We need to let your mom talk to her lawyer now." But Jake shook his head fiercely. His small body trembled as he suddenly stood up from the wooden bench. "Wait," he called out, his voice higher and louder than he intended. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at the small boy in the oversized blue sweater. "Young man, please sit down," Judge Winters said firmly but not unkindly. She had seen many emotional outbursts in her courtroom over the years. "Please," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Can I talk to you? About my mom?" The prosecutor frowned and started to object, but Judge Winters raised her hand. After 15 years on the bench, she had learned to trust her instincts. Something about the boy's desperate expression made her pause. "This is highly unusual," Judge Winters said, looking at both attorneys. "However, I will allow the child to speak." She nodded to the bailiff. "Please bring him forward." Jake walked slowly to the front of the courtroom, each step careful and deliberate. His worn sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor. He still clutched his inhaler tightly in his right hand like a talisman. Sarah watched her son approach, tears streaming down her face. The bailiff guided Jake to stand in front of the judge's bench. Up close, Judge Winters could see the dark circles under the boy's eyes and the worry lines on his young face that no 10-year-old should have. "What's your name, young man?" Judge Winters asked, her tone softer now. "Jake Miller, ma'am," he replied, his voice small but determined. "And you want to speak about your mother?" Jake nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He took a deep breath, the way his doctor had taught him when he felt an asthma attack coming. "My mom isn't a bad person." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside was a collection of coins and crumpled dollar bills. "I've been saving money," he explained. "I collect bottles and cans after school. This is $37.42. Judge Winters leaned forward, puzzled. "What is this for, Jake?" "It's to pay back the store," Jake said as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "If I give them this money, and we pay back a little bit every month, couldn't my mom stay with me instead of going to prison?" Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, trying to stifle a sob. "My mom works really hard," Jake continued, gaining confidence. "She has 2 jobs. She cleans offices at night after her day job, but sometimes I have really bad asthma attacks, and the medicine costs a lot." Jake held up his inhaler. "Last month, I couldn't breathe good, and we didn't have enough money for a new one. Mom was really scared." His voice wavered slightly. "She only did the bad thing because of me." He looked directly at Judge Winters, his eyes wise beyond his years. "If she goes away, who's going to remind me to use my inhaler? Who's going to read to me at night? Who's going to make sure I take my medicine?" Jake's words hung in the silent courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked down at his notes, uncomfortable with the raw emotion of the moment. "Mom never buys stuff for herself," Jake added quietly. "She even cut up her own blanket to make my costume for the school play when I was a tree." Judge Winters removed her glasses, revealing eyes that had suddenly become moist. She had sentenced hundreds of people during her career, but somehow, this small boy's simple words had pierced through her professional detachment. Judge Winters cleared her throat and put her glasses back on, trying to regain her composure. In her 15 years on the bench, she had trained herself to remain detached, to see only the facts of each case. But Jake Miller's earnest plea had touched something deep within her. "Jake," she said gently, "I appreciate you speaking up for your mother. That shows a lot of courage." The boy stood straight, his small chest puffed out slightly. The inhaler was still clutched tightly in his hand, a constant reminder of his condition. "The court needs to take a brief recess," Judge Winters announced, her voice slightly unsteady. She looked at the bailiff. 20 minutes. As she rose, she gestured for both attorneys to approach her chambers. Sarah remained standing at the defendant's table, uncertain what was happening. The social worker came forward to lead Jake back to his seat. "Wait," Sarah called out. The bailiff gave her a warning look, but Judge Winters nodded her permission. Sarah knelt down and embraced her son, holding him as if she might never hold him again. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. "But Mom has to face the consequences of what she did. It's going to be okay." Jake's small arms wrapped around her neck. "I'm not scared," he told her, though his trembling body said otherwise. "I know you're not," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "You're the bravest person I know." The bailiff gently separated them, and Sarah watched as Ms. Thompson led Jake back to the bench. The judge and attorneys disappeared into chambers, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and fears. In her chambers, Judge Winters sat heavily in her leather chair. The prosecutor, Mr. Davis, and Sarah's attorney, Ms. Jenkins, waited for her to speak. "I'm reconsidering the sentence," Judge Winters finally said. Mr. Davis frowned. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the law is clear. Emotional appeals shouldn't." "I'm well aware of the law, Mr. Davis," Judge Winters interrupted. Her voice was firm, but there was something different in her eyes. "I'm also aware of judicial discretion." She reached for a photograph on her desk, turning it slightly. The attorneys could see it was a picture of a young boy, perhaps 12 years old. "My grandson has asthma," she said quietly. "His parents have excellent insurance. I've never had to worry about whether they could afford his medication. She looked up at the attorneys. Not everyone is so fortunate. Ms. Jenkins leaned forward eagerly. Your Honor, there are alternatives to incarceration that would serve justice while keeping this family together. Such as? The judge asked. Community service at the free medical clinic downtown. They need administrative help, and it would be fitting given Ms. Miller's situation. Ms. Jenkins pulled out some papers from her briefcase. I've taken the liberty of preparing an alternative sentencing recommendation. Judge Winters took the papers and studied them. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This doesn't change the fact that she committed fraud, he pointed out. No, it doesn't, Judge Winters agreed. And there must be consequences. But I've seen what happens to children when they enter the system, even temporarily. She set the papers down. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. Back in the courtroom, Sarah sat with her head bowed. She knew what awaited her: processing, prison orientation, and then months away from her son. The thought made her physically ill. The door to the judge's chambers opened. The attorneys emerged, followed by Judge Winters, who took her seat at the bench. Her expression gave nothing away. The court is back in session, the bailiff announced. Judge Winters looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Miller, please rise. Sarah stood on shaky legs. Jake leaned forward on his bench, his eyes wide with hope and fear. After careful consideration, Judge Winters began, I have decided to modify my ruling. A murmur went through the small courtroom. Sarah hardly dared to breathe. While I cannot ignore the seriousness of check fraud, Judge Winters continued, I believe justice will be better served in this case through alternative sentencing. For the first time that day, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Ms. Miller, Judge Winters continued, her voice firm but with a new note of compassion, I am suspending your prison sentence in favor of 2 years probation. Sarah's knees almost buckled beneath her. The public defender quickly grabbed her elbow to steady her. Additionally, the judge went on, you will complete 500 hours of community service at the West Side Medical Clinic. I understand they have an assistance program for families struggling with medical costs. Perhaps you'll find it helpful not just for completing your sentence, but for your personal situation as well. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This was not the outcome he had expected. He stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may, the state feels that. The state has been heard, Mr. Davis. Judge Winters cut him off firmly. My decision is final. She turned back to Sarah. You will also make full restitution to Linden's Market for the fraudulent amount, plus a 10% penalty. This can be paid in installments over the next 12 months. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah agreed quickly. I'll work extra shifts. I'll pay it all back. I believe you will, Judge Winters said. She glanced at Jake, who was now standing, his face a mixture of confusion and hope. Young man, you may join your mother now. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He ran forward, dodging around the bailiff, and threw himself into his mother's arms. Sarah lifted him up, holding him tightly despite his growing size. He was getting too big to be carried, but at that moment, neither of them cared. Does this mean you're coming home with me? Jake whispered into her ear. Yes, baby, Sarah whispered back. We're going home together. Judge Winters watched the reunion with an uncharacteristic softness in her eyes. Then she tapped her gavel gently. Ms. Miller, you will report to your probation officer tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. They will explain all the terms of your probation. Failure to comply with any aspect of this sentence will result in the reinstatement of your prison term. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah said, still holding Jake close. I understand completely. Court is adjourned, Judge Winters announced, tapping her gavel once more. As people began to file out of the courtroom, Judge Winters collected her papers. She noticed Jake break away from his mother and approach the bench. The bailiff started to intercept him, but the judge waved him off. Thank you for not taking my mom away, Jake said simply, looking up at her. Judge Winters leaned forward slightly. You're welcome, Jake, but I need you to understand something important. What your mother did was wrong, even though she did it for a good reason. There are consequences for our actions, even when we're trying to help someone we love. Jake nodded solemnly. I know, Mom already told me that. She said even if they took her away, I shouldn't be mad at anyone because she broke the rules. Judge Winters felt a lump form in her throat. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She is? Jake agreed earnestly. She's the best mom ever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small plastic bag of money again. Do I still need to give this to the store? Judge Winters smiled gently. That's very responsible of you, but your mother will handle the repayment as part of her probation. You should keep your savings. Jake seemed to consider this for a moment. Maybe I can help her pay it back a little bit. Is that okay? That's between you and your mother, Judge Winters said. But Jake, it's also important that you get to be a kid. Sarah approached cautiously, stopping a respectful distance from the bench. Jake, honey, we should let the judge get back to work. Jake nodded and turned to go, but then he paused and looked back at Judge Winters. My doctor says I might outgrow my asthma someday, then Mom won't have to worry so much. With those words, he rejoined his mother. Judge Winters watched them leave the courtroom, Sarah's arm protectively around her son's shoulders. When they were gone, she removed her glasses and wiped quickly at her eyes before anyone could notice. 2 weeks after the court hearing, Sarah and Jake Miller arrived at the West Side Medical Clinic for Sarah's first day of community service. The building was old but well maintained, with faded blue paint and clean windows. A small sign by the entrance read, "Serving our community since 1982. Are you nervous, Mom? Jake asked as they stood outside the entrance. Sarah smoothed down her simple blouse and adjusted her hair, which she had carefully tied back in a neat ponytail. A little, she admitted. But it's going to be okay. Remember what we talked about? Jake nodded. This is part of making things right. Sarah had been completely honest with Jake about her mistake and its consequences. She believed he was old enough to understand the importance of taking responsibility for one's actions, even when the reason seemed justified. That's right, she said, giving his hand a squeeze. And Miss Thompson will pick you up after school and bring you here when I finish at 5. Inside, they were greeted by a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her name tag read, Dr. Gloria Martinez, Medical Director. You must be Sarah Miller, Dr. Martinez said, extending her hand. And this young man must be Jake. It's nice to meet you, Sarah said, shaking her hand firmly. I'm reporting for my community service hours. Dr. Martinez nodded. Judge Winters called me personally about your case. We've worked with her before on alternative sentencing arrangements. Sarah was surprised. The judge called you? She's on our clinic's advisory board, Dr. Martinez explained. She takes a special interest in healthcare access issues. Looking down at Jake, Dr. Martinez smiled warmly. And how's your asthma doing today, young man? Jake seemed surprised that she knew about his condition. It's okay. I haven't had an attack in 2 weeks. That's excellent news, Dr. Martinez said. She turned back to Sarah. After you get Jake off to school, come back and we'll get you started. You'll be helping with paperwork and filing today, but I'd like to talk to you about your situation as well. Sarah tensed slightly. She was prepared to work hard at her community service, but she hadn't expected to discuss her personal circumstances. Don't worry, Dr. Martinez added, noticing Sarah's discomfort. Judge Winters mentioned that you might benefit from our assistance programs. We have several options for families with chronic health conditions. After dropping Jake at school, Sarah returned to the clinic. The waiting room was already filling with patients, elderly people with oxygen tanks, mothers with young children, and workers in uniforms who had clearly come before their shifts. Dr. Martinez led Sarah to a small office at the back of the clinic. This is where you'll be working. We're desperately behind on filing insurance claims and organizing patient records. 3 months passed quickly as Sarah settled into her routine at the West Side Medical Clinic. Monday through Thursday, she worked at her regular job as an administrative assistant at an insurance company. On Fridays and Saturdays, she completed her community service hours at the clinic, filing papers, organizing records, and, increasingly, helping patients understand the assistance programs available to them. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah was explaining a medication discount program to an elderly couple when she noticed Dr. Martinez speaking with a visitor near the entrance. The visitor was Judge Eleanor Winters. Sarah's heart beat faster. Although she had been meeting regularly with her probation officer and fulfilling all her court requirements, seeing the judge in person brought back the fear and shame of that day in court. "Mrs. Miller," Dr. Martinez called, waving her over. "Could you join us for a moment?" Sarah had excused herself from the couple and walked nervously to where Dr. Martinez and Judge Winters stood. The judge looked different in regular clothes, a simple sweater and slacks, that she had in her black robes. "Hello, Ms. Miller," Judge Winters said. Her voice was warmer than Sarah remembered. "Dr. Martinez has been telling me about your work here." "I'm just fulfilling my community service hours, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her eyes lowered. "Please, we're not in court now. Call me Eleanor," the judge said. "And from what Gloria tells me, you're doing much more than simply putting in hours. You've become quite the patient advocate." Dr. Martinez nodded enthusiastically. Sarah has a gift for explaining complex insurance rules in simple terms, and she genuinely cares about the people who come here. Sarah blushed at the praise. "I understand their struggles. Before coming here, I didn't know there were so many programs that could help families like mine." Judge Winters smiled. "That's actually why I'm here today. I'd like to talk with you about a new initiative we're developing. Is Jake here with you?" "Yes, he's in the children's corner," Sarah replied, pointing to a small area with books and toys where Jake sat reading. "Perfect," Judge Winters said. "Let's all have a chat." The four of them gathered in Dr. Martinez's office. Jake seemed impressed to meet the judge again, though in a less intimidating setting. "How's your asthma, Jake?" Judge Winters asked gently. "Much better," Jake said proudly. "I'm in Dr. Martinez's special program now. I got a new kind of inhaler that works better, and Mom doesn't have to worry so much about paying for it." Sarah smiled at her son. His health had indeed improved significantly since they began receiving care at the clinic. The financial burden had eased as well, allowing Sarah to focus on paying back her restitution without falling behind on other bills. "That's wonderful news," Judge Winters said. She looked at Sarah. "Ms. Miller." "Sarah, I've been working with Dr. Martinez on creating an advisory council for healthcare accessibility. We want to include people who have first-hand experience with the challenges of affording medical care." Sarah looked confused. "I'm not sure I understand." Dr. Martinez explained. "We want parents like you on our council, people who know what it's like to struggle with medical costs for their children. You would attend monthly meetings and help us design better support programs. Your perspective would be invaluable," Judge Winters added, "and the hours would count toward your community service." Sarah was speechless. When she'd stood in court that day, ashamed and terrified, she never imagined that the judge who sentenced her would one day ask for her help. I don't know what to say," Sarah stammered. Jake tugged at her sleeve. "Say yes, Mom. You always tell me to help other people when I can." Sarah looked down at her son's earnest face and felt a rush of pride. Despite everything they'd been through, he had remained compassionate and thoughtful. "He's right," Sarah said, smiling through sudden tears. "I would be honored to help." Judge Winters reached across the desk and gently squeezed Sarah's hand. In that moment, Sarah realized that sometimes justice could be more than punishment. It could also be about healing and second chances. 1 year had passed since that fateful day in Judge Winters' courtroom. Autumn leaves crunched under Sarah's feet as she walked toward the West Side Medical Clinic. Today was special. She would complete her final hours of community service. Sarah pushed open the familiar blue door of the clinic. The waiting room was busy as usual, but she noticed many new faces among the regular patients. Word had spread about the clinic's assistance programs, bringing more families seeking affordable health care. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez called out, emerging from her office. "Just the person I wanted to see." She was carrying a small wrapped package. "Good morning, Dr. Martinez," Sarah replied with a smile. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay," Dr. Martinez said. "We just received some exciting news. But first, where's Jake today?" "He's at a soccer game," Sarah explained proudly. "His asthma has been so well controlled that his coach let him join the team this season. Miss Thompson, you remember the social worker from my case. She's been volunteering as a coach and gave him a ride." Dr. Martinez beamed. "That's wonderful, and perfect timing with our news." She handed Sarah the small package. "This is for you, but don't open it yet. Judge Winters will be here in an hour for the advisory council meeting, and she wants you there." Sarah nodded, curious about the package but patient enough to wait. Over the past year, she had grown comfortable working with Judge Winters on the Healthcare Advisory Council. The judge was different outside the courtroom, warm, passionate about healthcare access, and surprisingly funny at times. As Sarah completed her filing tasks for the day, she reflected on how much had changed. She had paid off her restitution to Linden's Market months ago. The owner had even offered her a part-time job on Sundays, impressed by her determination to make things right. Between that, her regular job, and occasional overtime, Sarah had managed to build a small savings account for emergencies. Just before noon, Judge Winters arrived, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. She greeted the clinic staff warmly before spotting Sarah. "There you are," Judge Winters said, approaching with a smile. "Ready for your last day of community service?" "Yes, Your Honor. I mean, Eleanor." Sarah corrected herself with a laugh. Even after a year, she sometimes slipped into formal address. "Let's talk in Gloria's office," Judge Winters suggested. "She's gathering the other council members." In Dr. Martinez's office, a small group had assembled: nurses, a pharmacist, 2 other patients who had joined the advisory council, and Dr. Martinez herself. Everyone looked expectantly at Judge Winters. "I have wonderful news," Judge Winters announced. "The state has approved our grant proposal for the Children's Respiratory Care Initiative. Starting next month, we'll be able to provide free asthma medications and treatments to all children in the county whose families fall below certain income thresholds." The room erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. This program would help so many families avoid the desperate situation she had found herself in a year ago. And, Judge Winters continued, the approval committee specifically cited the personal stories shared by our advisory council as a compelling factor in their decision. She looked directly at Sarah. "Your experiences helped make this happen." Dr. Martinez stepped forward. "Sarah, that package I gave you, open it now." Sarah carefully unwrapped the small box to find a name badge inside. It read Sarah Miller, Patient Advocate Coordinator. "We'd like to offer you a paid position at the clinic," Dr. Martinez explained. 20 hours a week, helping families navigate the healthcare system and access assistance programs. Your community service may be ending, but we hope your time with us isn't." Sarah could barely speak through her emotion. I don't know what to say." Judge Winters smiled gently. "Say yes, Sarah. You've turned your mistake into something meaningful, not just for yourself and Jake, but for countless other families. That's what real justice looks like." Sarah looked around at the friendly faces in the room. From the depths of shame and fear, she had found a new purpose. She thought of Jake playing soccer, breathing freely, living the childhood he deserved. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I would be honored." 5 years had passed since that life-changing day in the courtroom. On a bright spring morning, the Westside Medical Clinic was hosting a special ceremony. Colorful balloons decorated the entrance, and a large banner hung above the door. "Grand opening, the Eleanor Winters Children's Health Wing." Inside, the clinic buzzed with excitement. The old waiting room had been expanded, and a new children's area featured cheerful murals of forests and animals. Medical staff in freshly pressed uniforms guided visitors through the new facilities, proudly showing off equipment that would serve the community's youngest patients. Sarah Miller, now the clinic's full-time patient advocacy director, straightened her blazer as she reviewed her speech cards. At 37, she looked younger than she had 5 years ago. The worry lines on her face had softened, replaced by laugh lines around her eyes. Her hair was cut in a stylish bob, and she carried herself with quiet confidence. "Mom, they're ready for us," called a teenage voice. Sarah looked up to see Jake, now 15, walking toward her. He had grown tall and lanky, his childhood roundness replaced by the beginnings of adult features. The inhaler that had once been his constant companion was nowhere in sight. He had indeed outgrown his severe asthma, though he still needed occasional treatments during pollen season. "How do I look?" Sarah asked, smoothing her hair nervously. Jake grinned, like someone who's about to give an awesome speech. Together, they walked to the small stage set up in the new wing's central area. Rows of chairs faced the podium, and nearly every seat was filled: clinic staff, patients, community members, and local officials. In the front row sat Dr. Martinez, her hair now completely silver, and next to her, Judge Eleanor Winters, who had recently announced her retirement after 20 years on the bench. The mayor of their small city approached the microphone first, welcoming everyone and speaking about the importance of accessible healthcare. Then Dr. Martinez took the stage, explaining how the new children's wing would serve thousands of young patients each year. And now, Dr. Martinez said, "I'd like to introduce someone very special. Sarah Miller joined our clinic under unusual circumstances, but she quickly became the heart and soul of our patient advocacy program. Sarah, please come up." The audience applauded warmly as Sarah took her place at the podium. She looked out at the friendly faces and felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you all for being here today," Sarah began. "5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom, certain that my life was over. I had made a terrible mistake out of desperation to help my son, and I was ready to accept my punishment." She paused, looking at Judge Winters, who smiled encouragingly. But something unexpected happened that day. A wise judge saw beyond my crime to the circumstances that led to it, and a brave 10-year-old boy spoke up with simple honesty that touched everyone's heart. Sarah gestured to Jake, who blushed slightly as people turned to look at him. "Instead of prison, I was given a chance to serve this clinic. What began as my punishment became my purpose. Working here showed me that my situation wasn't unique. Many families struggle with medical costs, especially for chronic conditions like my son's asthma." Sarah held up a small plastic bag. Several people in the audience gasped in recognition. "This bag contains $37.42, the exact amount my son offered to a judge 5 years ago, hoping to keep his mother out of prison. I've kept it all this time as a reminder of where we started. Today, I'm donating it as the first contribution to our new Children's Emergency Fund, which will help families facing medical crisis." She placed the bag in a decorative box on the podium as the audience applauded. The new Eleanor Winters Children's Health Wing will serve thousands of children each year. No parent who comes through these doors will ever have to choose between their child's health and breaking the law. Sarah looked directly at Judge Winters, whose eyes glistened with tears. "Judge Winters, you taught me that true justice isn't just about punishment. It's about rehabilitation, compassion, and second chances. You changed not just my life, but countless others through your vision for this clinic. Thank you for seeing the person behind the mistake, and for believing that one act doesn't define a life." As Sarah concluded her speech, Jake joined her on stage, bringing Judge Winters with him. The three embraced as cameras flashed, capturing the moment when justice, compassion, and hope came full circle.